Amen. Good morning. It's good to be with you. It's good to be able to sing praises with you to God. I love that song. That's my favorite song in the whole songbook. And it really sets off what we're going to talk about this morning. If you have your Bibles, open up to Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34. Exodus chapter 34, and we'll start at verse 5. Exodus chapter 34, verse 5. This is Moses on top of the mountain of Sinai, and he says this. Verse 5, Then the Lord descended in a cloud and stood with him there, and proclaimed the name of the Lord. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and the fourth generation. And Moses quickly bowed his head towards the earth and worshipped. I take some time every once in a while in these sermons and the studies that we do to focus on who God is and the character of God and who makes up God. What is his identity? And I think it's one of the most important things that we can study, because how can you have a relationship with someone that you don't know? And for us to be God's followers, we kind of have to know who we're following. Also, in our world, there's a lot of different perception of who God is. And it's very easy to get the wrong perception of God if you don't know who he is. It's kind of like those situations in which, I'm sure you've been in this situation before, where you have to have a very difficult conversation with someone. Maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a coworker. And so you play out in your mind how that's going to go. And so you speak for that other person because you know what they're going to say. And then it never turns out how you imagine it, because you don't know people as well as you think you know people. I'm sure nobody's ever been there. But that's kind of what people do with God sometimes. They play out in their imagination how God would react to them, who they think God is. But if people's image of God and identity of God is defaulted, the perception they'll get from him is totally different than who he actually is. And so it's good for us from time to time to really look and concentrate on who God is. And of course, when we're spending any time in the Bible and his word, we're getting that sense of who he is. But it's really good to really nail down on these verses like this, that specifically it's God himself saying, this is who I am. These are the characteristics that make up who I am. And so we'll spend a few lessons from time to time on who God is. These verses may be familiar to you. Last year I did a whole series on verse 6, going through every attribute and talking about how God is that attribute. He's merciful and he's gracious and he's long-suffering, and all these different attributes that makes out who he is. Today we will focus on verse 7. I never got to verse 7 last time, so I'm going to get to verse 7 this time. And then in subsequent lessons, we're going to actually focus on Jesus, because Jesus is the ultimate revelation of who God is. But look at verse 7. Verse 7 seems to be almost a contradiction in some ways, because it talks about keeping his steadfast love for thousands and forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. And we're all like, yeah, good God. And then it says, but who will by no means clear the guilty and visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children and children to the third and fourth generation. I don't like that God as much. They seem to be different. One is kind of talking about God's mercy and his long-sufferingness, and the other one's talking about, let's sum it up, as God's justice. How do these two things mesh together? And it's just not a theoretical problem, it's also a relational problem. Because if you don't combine these two things God says he is, how can you relate to someone that you don't know how they're going to relate to you? If you don't know if God is one moment is going to be merciful and gracious, and the next is going to be judgmental, and you don't learn how to make those things mesh, he's going to seem like he's all over the place. And you're not going to be able to relate to that person, to that God. It'd be the same way as if you were trying to have a relationship with someone whose emotions were wildly all over the place. One day, you could do the worst thing to him, and he's like, don't worry about it. And the next, you do something small, and then he just like, kabam, and he comes off on you. You can't have a relationship with that person. And if that is your image of God, you can't have a relationship with God. It's very important that we understand and we try to understand God in a way that we can make God's mercy and his justice make sense in our minds. Now, of course, there's the caveat. We're humans, and we're immortal, we're made of the dust, and God is way above us in so many different ways. But God, I believe, revealed himself in this way so that we can understand him however we can, and that we can have a relationship with him. So in the next two lessons that we do, the next lesson, the second one will be on God's mercy, and we're going to look at that a little bit more, and what he talks about giving his steadfast love for thousands. And then the last one, we're going to talk about God's justice and how he visits the iniquity on the children's children to the third and fourth generation. Right before that, though, I want to finish the rest of this lesson by looking at the background in which these words take place. Because so often do we take these words out of context and we just kind of, take words out of context in general. We just apply them. But God is very much revealing himself in the context of this story. Do you remember what's happening around in the story? God led the Israel out of Egypt, saved them from slavery, led them through the Red Sea to this mountain, Mount Sinai, which he revealed his word to his people, himself to his people. And his word and what he expected of Israel. We call it the Ten Commandments. That's the summary of it. Once you know it, 40 days later, Israel violates the first commandment, like right off the bat. In chapter 32 of Exodus, they build a golden calf. It is the fall of Israel. And so we see how God responds to this. Moses and God are up on the mountain, and God is seeing Israel make this golden calf and worship it by feasting and drinking and having sex together. And they're treating God like one of the gods of Egypt or Canaan. And how does God respond to this? He tells Moses, go and wipe them all out. I'm done with them. Because this is in a long line of them being unfaithful to God. But Moses pleads with him. He's the intercessor at this point of the story. And God forgives him. However, there are 3,000. They seem to be very defiant, that keep on participating in this pagan worship. And so they were killed for their actions. And so here you have a God that forgives the people. He keeps his covenant love with them. He doesn't wipe them all out. But at the same time, he judges Israel, and especially those 3,000. And then we come to this place in the story, and God is not just listing a bunch of attributes or characteristics that are random to describe himself. He's saying, what kind of God would act the way I did in this story? He's telling Moses how he acted and why he did what he did. I am compassionate. He connects with people. He connects with Israel on an emotional level, and he's hurt when they do something that is wrong. I am gracious. God does just not feel when someone does something wrong. He does something about it. It's an action word. He keeps his covenant with his people and gives them something they don't deserve, which is grace. I am slow to anger, or some say long-suffering. This does not mean that God does not get angry at all. It just means he knows how to keep his anger in check. He doesn't fly off the handle. And this is, again, in a long section of the Israel testing God. And he's abounding in love, steadfast love, and faithfulness. We had a whole lesson on steadfast love, hesed, which is its own kind of word. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. God's steadfast commitment to his covenant people. He doesn't remove his covenant from Israel, but he stays with them. That's the kind of God Israel served. That's how he revealed himself to his people. And that's the same God that we serve. Just like he was faithful and long-suffering, compassionate, merciful and gracious to Israel, he's the same to us. When we sin, he is hurt by our sin. When we do something wrong, he's gracious to us. He gives us a gift that we do not deserve. And he's slow to anger for us. I dare to say that many of us have not sinned just once in our life or twice in our life. But it's been something we've done many times. And yet God just go blammo and just smite us. Instead, he is long-suffering. And he's steadfast in his commitment to us. He's keeping his covenant with us, and he's faithful to us even to the end. This is the God that we serve. And this is who God says he is. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping his steadfast love for thousands, and forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin. Did you know this was the most quoted verse in the Old Testament? This verse, chapter 6 and chapter 7, is the most quoted verse in the Old Testament. This is a place that the Old Testament prophets and writers go back to over and over and say, this is who you serve, Israel. It's a God who has steadfast love for thousands of generations. If you just think about it, how long is 1,000 generations? If the average generation is 35 to 40 years, quick math, that's 35 to 40,000 years. I mean, it's only been 3,200 years since this took place. God said this to us. It means a really long time. It's poetic. God's steadfast love is never going to end. His faithfulness to us and to Israel, the new Israel, will never end. And if you just use that to contrast to the judgment side that we'll get to, when he says, I will visit the iniquity of the fathers, of the children's, to the third and fourth generation. If you just take those, steadfast love for 1,000 generations, iniquity for 3 or 4 generations. If you just put those on side by side, which one is tipping the scales? And they're both part of God's nature. But as we looked at verse 6 last year, God over and over again wants to show mercy. He wants to show compassion and steadfast love. That's the way he wants to go. But if you don't let him, he'll show judgment and justice. God is steadfast love. That's one of the things that he is defined by. Love is, like I've said many times, a useless word in the English dictionary. We say I love Chick-fil-A and I love my wife, and if those two mean the same thing, I'm in trouble. It is a very useless word. It means so much. It's the same thing as a preference in what I like, as the same thing as the most deeply committed relationship I have on this earth. And we use the same word to describe them both. It's very much a useless word. And in America in the 21st century, we use it primarily as an emotional word. I love you. It's something that we describe as an emotion, where over and over in the Bible, it's never used as that. It's always used as an action word. Love is always an action in the Bible. And specifically this word, the steadfast love or covenant love. This is a love that is described as action, as a commitment. It is a committed love to show your actions to a person. It's not about just how you feel. Have you ever known someone that was awesome? They were great. They may be your friends or someone younger or someone older that you thought they are going to be a great husband and wife for someone. They're just awesome. And then they married the bummiest person on the face of the earth. And you're like, that is such a waste. Why are you signing yourself up to that heartache and that commitment for that long to love this person that's a bum and a jerk? And yet that's what God did for Israel. It's what God did for us. His committed love to us is so great that even when we are less than great, we're unfaithful, He still keeps His commitment to us to love us. That is like an amazing thing. And I don't think God always feels like loving Israel. I don't think God always feels like loving us. I mean, do you always feel like loving your spouse all the time? No, you're crazy if you think that. But there are times in which you love them anyway. Because love, this kind of steadfast, hesed love, is a committed love. That even when you don't feel like it, even though it's not the perfect ideal of what you figure marriage would be like, you love them still, and God loves us still. He's faithful to us, and He never leaves us. If your perception of God is that He is out to get you, and that He's just waiting to catch you to slip up, that is distortion of who God says He is. Because that's not the kind of God that He says He is. He's one that's committed to loving you. That is who God describes Himself as. And so what that means is God signs Himself up to also being a forgiving God. Because how is God going to keep Himself in a relationship with people that He knows are going to be unfaithful to Him? He has to be forgiving. He has to accept those people back when they say they're sorry. And this is not just a reluctantly given forgiveness. This freely comes out. That is what He did with Israel over and over again, and especially just before this. God offers that if we come to Him with humility and openness and to own up to our own shortcomings and failures, He will carry our sin. That's actually what the word forgiveness means. The original word in the Hebrew forgiveness means to carry. He carries our sin for us. And some people have a really hard time with that. Some people, they may know it intellectually, but they don't really take it to heart. And they carry their own sins with them. And they think that God wouldn't forgive me of this. Or when anything bad happens in my life, well, that's what I get because I did this great, horrible thing a long time ago. Or there's a generational curse because of what so-and-so did. And that is nowhere near in the Bible. That is unbiblical. It is contrary to what God says about Himself. He is willing and He's able to forgive those who come to Him and say they don't want to carry their own sin anymore. They want to own up to what they've done and give it to God. And I'm not saying there won't be consequences for your actions on earth, but between you and God in that relationship, it's clean. It's wiped out. Because that's who God is. He's a God of steadfast love and faithfulness. And it lasts for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. That's what God says about himself. That's the God that we serve. Lord, the Lord, God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping his steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. We had talked about how God is a God of steadfast love and a God of faithfulness and forgiveness, and that is who he is. But he's also a God of justice. And when he says, who will by no means, man, it's really difficult wording there. Who will by no means clear the guilty? And it's really interesting because it seems completely opposite to the phrase that's right before then. He says he's forgiving the iniquity and transgression and sin. And then right after it says, who will by no means clear the guilty? Which one is it? And like most things, it's both. It seems like this phrase is totally an opposite to what we just read. But remember the context of the story. These words are not out of context. They're in the context of the story. What had just happened? He had forgave Israel. He didn't blot out all of Israel. But remember those 3,000. Those 3,000 that were more defiant, that kept doing what they wanted to do, were destroyed. God said, okay, if you don't want me to carry your sin, if you don't want to own up to your sin, if you don't want forgiveness, then you'll have to carry your own sin. And what that means is death. And God's forgiveness does not mean that there is a blank check. And so if you're thinking, okay, God's a God of long-suffering and love and forgiveness, blank check. I can just do whatever I want. I can get out free jail card. I skip out on hell, live life how I want. If that's the thing that you want, you have another thing coming. And what that person is actually saying is, I don't want really forgiveness. I just want you to make it okay what I'm doing. I want you to minimize my sin. That's not forgiveness at all. And God says you have another thing coming if that's what you think. And let's be honest. Do any of us want to live in a world that there is no judgment? Do you want to live in a world where there's no hope that all things are made right? Do you want to live in a world where the worst people, the most awful people you can think about, the people that kill people, the people that rape people, the worst people that you think about, and they don't have their judgment now. They have a long and prosperous life, and they think that life is great. You don't want to live in a world where everything is made right, where justice comes to that person, as well as justice coming to the righteous person, the person that lived as best as they could in this life, and that all they met is suffering. You don't want justice to come to that person as well. Do you really not want to live in a world where there's no hope that people will get the consequences of the life they led? Judgment is what makes this life full of meaning. If there's no judgment, what you did here would be meaningless. Had no meaning whatsoever. Judgment is, God's justice is what gives meaning to our lives. And so God says, I will by no means clear the guilty. If you don't want to admit your wrongdoing, you don't want to own up, you don't want to repent, you don't want to ask for forgiveness, then you could carry your sin by yourself. And what that means is death. What he says, though, after that is very interesting, and it has caused probably a lot of confusion over the years. It says, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. I think it's been commonly understood, and this is kind of how I understood the passage until recently, something like this. Grandpa was a terrible person. Grandpa was horrible. He was alcoholic. He cheated on grandma. He led a life that was horrible. And so, Jimmy over here, who's the grandson, he suffers because of that, even though Jimmy does nothing. And I certainly think that there are consequences to someone's actions. And those consequences go beyond just themselves. Like if I, walk up and hit Kyle, that doesn't just harm my relationship with God and Kyle, that also hurts Kyle's eye. Like there's a consequence to that. He suffers because of that. However, to take this and say, God is the direct one that is visiting iniquity on that person, that children's children, is I think where it goes a little wrong. That God gives the consequences, not just that grandpa, not just to grandpa, but to the grandson. I think that is not right. And I don't think that's who God is. He doesn't give generational curses. God is not judging your family because something your great-grandfather did. And there's a couple of reasons for this. We don't have time to turn there, but Deuteronomy chapter 24, he talks about each dying for their own sin. The father will die for his sin. The son will die for his sin. You don't kill the other one for the other one's sin. Each person owns their own consequences for their sin. And then also Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 20, it says, the one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be accredited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked will be charged against them. So he's saying basically that whatever you do, you get what's coming to you. And specifically in Ezekiel, the people of Israel were crying out to God and saying, it's unfair that we're in exile. It was our fathers. They're the really bad ones. They're the ones that caused this. And Ezekiel basically says, no, you were really bad too. You just don't want to admit it. And you deserve this as much as they did. And so I don't think that God, because your grandfather did or father did something wrong, God punishes you because of it. I think that's very unbiblical, and really that's not just. So what does it mean? What does this verse mean when he says he's going to visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children's children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation? I think it really comes down to the understanding of what the third and fourth mean. Do you remember reading in the Proverbs where it said, like, there are 3 things too amazing and 4 I do not understand? Or there's other ones that talk, there's like 5 things God hates and even 6 he loathes. And Amos does this a lot, actually, in his book. He said, for 3 sins and even 4, God will bring judgment. Well, which is it? Is Amos going to bring, is God going to bring judgment on 3 sins, or is he going to bring 4 sins? I don't think that's the point. I think whatever he's saying is, whatever number of sins it is, God is going to bring judgment on them. And so if you apply that phrase, that wording to this passage, I think what God is saying here is however many generations sin, I'm going to bring judgment on them. So you're going to be the first generation and they sin, I'm going to bring judgment upon them. If it's the second, however many it is that sin, judgment will come. God is saying if you go into idolatry and you worship as a pagan, as these people's fathers did, I'm going to judge them just like I judged you. I will punish you just like I punished them. God is saying he doesn't change. He doesn't bend the rules. He doesn't change the rules. What was a sin then is still a sin now, which will be a sin in the future, and he will judge accordingly. He is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. I think that's what he's saying in this passage. God is just. to our grandparents, to our parents, to us, to our children, to our grandchildren. God is the same, and he is just to every one of them. But God is great, and he is merciful, and he's long-suffering, and he wants to forgive people. What is your picture of God? How do you perceive God? And if you want to, I think, if you want a good idea of how you picture God, picture yourself before God. How do you imagine that situation going? Imagine yourself before God and you just sin. How do you imagine that situation going? I think it really shows your picture of God. Because if you see a God that is just waiting to beat you up as soon as you commit a sin, or that is disappointed at you, how dare you, you never live up to my expectations, I think that's a wrong sense of who God says he is, of who he wants to be, a long-suffering. Also, but on the other hand, if you see a God that doesn't care at all, because that's what it is. If you think God's not a God of justice, it's really just a non-caring God who doesn't care about what you do. You can do whatever you want. He could care less. That's a wrong view of God too. He very much cares about what you do. And your sin definitely hurts him. But he's a God that is faithful and forgiving. That if you're the type of person that understands how they've hurt God and how they've hurt other people and what they've done, and you own up to that, you repent and say, I don't want to live this way anymore. And I'm going to make my life right. He's a God that forgives that. Makes it right in your relationship. And he's a God that's steadfast in his love. He's committed to you. He wants to show mercy. He wants to show grace. And he wants to love you. He's a good Father that can't wait to be with you, with him in heaven. What is your perception of God? Because that will directly determine how you serve him. I hope that you have a perception of God that is accurate to what he says he is. If we can help you at all, if we can help you to make things right before God, if you haven't made the commitment, if you're not in covenant relationship, you haven't been baptized, we can help with that too. If we can help you in any spiritual way whatsoever, come forward as we stand, as we sing.